In the late 14th century, Richard II of England faced a number of problems, like the Peasant Revolt,
the growth of the Lollard heresy,
and the ongoing 100 Years' War in France. England had lost a lot of territory,
and both the Despencer's Crusade in Flanders,
and the 1385 Scottish expedition failed.
Because of these military failures, the king's wealthy uncle, John of Gaunt, left in order to try and claim the throne of Castile, and rumors of a French invasion began to circulate.
So Richard tried to raise taxes for defense in 1386,
but Parliament refused to raise taxes because Richard,
who was then still just a teenager, had installed many of his unpopular court
favorites into powerful positions.
In particular, Michael de la Pole, who was the Earl of Suffolk and Lord Chancellor, and Richard de Vere, the Earl of Ireland Parliament, demanded that they be removed from their positions. But Richard refused and tried to make peace with France. In order to deal with this new internal dispute, so nobles like the Duke of Gloucester,
the Earl of Arundel, and later Henry Bolingbroke,
the Earl of Derby rose up in 1387.
They quickly defeated Richard de Vere in battle. As King Richard fled to the Tower of London, these rebelling nobles, known as the Lord Appellants,
were then in control of the country, formed the merciless Parliament, and began to target the king's old favourites. However, the Scottish attacked northern England,
and just a year later, John of Gaunt returned from Spain.
After failing to claim the Castilian throne, with his help Richard,
then 22 was able to declare himself of age
and reassert his authority.
To do this, he promised to lower taxes,
something he was able to do thanks to a truce with France. And he created an elaborate court system that reinforced the power of the monarchy. For instance, he offered a white heart badge to his supporters, rebuilt Westminster Hall, made people call him Your Highness,
and elevated his prestige through art.
However, after Devereux defeat and removal from power, English control in Eastern Ireland had diminished. So in 1394, Richard launched a huge expedition to Wexford to reassert his influence there.
But in 1397, to quell any further dissent,
he ordered the arrest of the Lord Appellants,
who rebelled against him, the Duke of Gloucester, and the Earl of Arundel were arrested, while others fled into exile. And Henry Bolingbroke, the Earl of Derby, who had spent the previous years crusading,
also heard news that he was going to be targeted
by the king, but Henry in particular was a serious threat to Richard's rule, because he was the son of John of Gaunt,
and grandson of Edward III of England. And as Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt's descendants became the House of Lancaster, a branch of the Plantagenet house
that would later fight the House of York
in the War of the Roses. So Henry met with Richard, and the two agreed to a trial by combat. But Richard changed his mind and exiled Henry for 10 years in 1398.
Then a year later, John of Gaunt died, and Richard took control of his lands,
preventing Henry from doing so.
And with his newfound wealth,
Richard launched another expedition to Ireland, along with all of the loyal nobles and knights. However, in France, Charles VI had become increasingly insane, and his younger brother Louis, the Duke of Orleans, became regent. Louis agreed to allow Henry, Bolingbroke, and fellow exiles to set sail for England,
where they met up with dissatisfied nobles,
whose families had either suffered loss of lands or had family members killed. One of these nobles, for instance,
was the Earl of Northumberland,
Henry Percy, who was angry with Richard for granting Westmoreland to the Neville family.
Together they marched across central England
and gained the support of local nobility, like Edmund of Langley, the first Duke of York, who was serving as custodian of the realm while Richard was away.
Richard returned to the mainland in late July, arriving in Wales, but by then,
it became apparent that he could not muster enough support, so in mid-August, he met with Henry, agreed to surrender, and was imprisoned in the Tower of London. However, Henry Bolingbroke still needed to justify his claim to the throne,
because the heir at the time was Edmund Mortimer,
the descendant of Lionel of Antwerp. So Henry declared that Richard had decided to give up his throne because he was an unworthy monarch.
But nobles loyal to Richard
plotted to capture Henry during a tournament and kill him. This plot was discovered, and the nobles rose their standard in rebellion in December 1399. But this, the Epiphany Rising, was able to gain very little support, and the Earls of Salisbury, Kent, Gloucester, Exeter, and others were promptly caught and executed.
Richard was likely killed shortly afterwards.
However, his fate remains a mystery, and Henry Bolingbroke, now Henry IV,
faced a number of new rebellions, notably in Wales.